back to the King's Corner, the place for all things Bethesda. I am the KingFanMan with another Fallout Scary Places. But this time we're going to Boston. That means it's a Fallout 4 Scary Places. And we're going to Fort Warren. That is the castle that we all know so well. But I think we're going to get to know it a little bit better. Fort Warren, better known as the Castle from Fallout 4, is a 28-acre fort built in 1833 on George's Island. The fort was named after the Revolutionary War hero Dr. Joseph Warren, who sent Paul Revere on his famous ride. The fort was built to protect the entrance of Boston Harbor from any who might dare to try to attack. Of course, it was originally the British threat that caused the building of the fort, but would later be used against many other American foes. The fort was built with Quincy granite, mined and brought across the harbor from granaries from Quincy, Massachusetts. The walls of the fort were made thick enough to stop the fire from close-by ships. The fort was made as a pentagonal bastion, which refers to the strange layout and shape that the fort has. But its layout gives it many advantages, such as stronger walls, more line of sight, stronger defense, and increased placement of artillery, and many more advantages. The full construction of the fort was not finished until 1858. In 1861, the Civil War broke out, and Fort Warren served as Boston's main line of defense against invasion by the Confederate Navy. It was the fifth largest fort of the 42 Union forts during the Civil War. Fort Warren was equipped with artillery on all 5 of its bastions, and it also had additional guns mounted in casements all over the fort. The fort was definitely a stronghold for the Union Army. During the Civil War, it was also used as a recruiting and training camp for new Union soldiers just joining. They would quickly be trained at the fort before being sent off to the battlefield. But no doubt the thing that Fort Warren is most known for during the war is it was used as a Confederate prison, or as some would call it, a prisoner of war camp. The first Confederate prisoners were sent to Fort Warren in October of 1861, which included 155 political prisoners and over 600 military prisoners. It is also well known that sometimes the Union Army would actually lock up some of its own citizens in Boston if they thought they were sympathetic with the Confederate cause. The actual mayor of Baltimore, Maryland, was a prisoner at Fort Warren, along with many of the members of the Maryland legislature. Some of the other famous prisoners at Fort Warren were the governor of Kentucky, along with Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. The prison became overcrowded very rapidly as they maintained well over 1,000 prisoners at all times. And due to the overcrowding and poor food, at least 13 deaths are recorded among the prisoners staying at Fort Warren. But there may have been many more, because these were only the official recorded numbers, and many times during the Civil War, prisoners of war did not have the protections that they do today. There were no written rules of how they must be treated, and sadly, many times they were simply forgotten and brushed aside. And if one was to pass while locked up, they would just be thrown out or burnt like the trash. Now stop and consider for just a moment the souls that have passed through this fort. Think of all the feet that have walked between these walls. Imagine just a moment the emotion, the agony, the fear that the Confederate prisoners went through, knowing that they would probably never see home ever again, thinking that these dark walls, these terrible cells of this fort truly might be the last thing that they would ever get to see. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, wrote while he was imprisoned at Fort Warren, and he said, "The horrors of imprisonment, of close confinement, no one to see or talk to, with the reflection of being cut off. For I know not how long and perhaps forever. From communication with dear ones at home, it's beyond description. Words utterly fail to express the soul's anguish. As the war raged on in early 1862, a young Confederate officer from Georgia named Samuel Lanier was captured by Union troops and imprisoned at the fort. Samuel was from a small Georgia town and had just been married before the war started. Just as he and his young wife, Melanie, who had been his sweetheart since they were both young kids, should have been starting their lives together, the call to war came. Now, Samuel would have much rather stayed in Georgia with his new wife, but all the men of his small town were desperately needed by the Confederacy. Even the young men and teens of the town left their homes, left their families, and marched off, many to never return again. Samuel's sense of duty to his town, to his state, to his family, to his friends, it would win out. So he kissed his bride, and he left, going to war. Now here he sits, a prisoner of the enemy, not knowing if he will even get to see tomorrow. Samuel managed to get a letter out to Melanie, and even though we don't have that letter today, I am sure it wasn't a happy letter. Maybe he did give her a little encouragement that he was at least alive in Boston, or was it a letter telling her goodbye? The main reason I wonder is because if he had been caught, or if the ones helping him get his letter out had been caught, they all would have been killed. Why did he risk his life to get a letter out to his wife? Maybe it was because he thought he was never going to get to talk to her ever again. Another reason why I believe it was a letter of desperation is because of his wife's reaction to the letter, because that we do know very well. Upon receiving her husband's letter, she immediately packed a bag, left her small town, and headed toward Boston. Why was she coming to Boston? Was she going to plead for her husband's life, his safety, or even his freedom? No. She soon would have a much grander plan than this. She traveled to a distant family that she had in Virginia, told them of her situation, and over the next few days, her and her family devised a plan, a wild and crazy and dangerous plan. Her family members in Virginia had friends in the Boston area who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. So they traveled to Boston, and with the help of her new friends, she cut her hair very short, made some necessary adjustments, and put on a Union uniform that her new friends had for her to wear. And her bold new plan was going to be to sneak onto the island, somehow get into the fort, and break free her husband, because in her mind, he didn't have much time, and that might have been true. For several days they planned and planned. One of the older men that had been helping her was a former Union soldier that had worked at the fort for years. He knew the full layout of the fort and had drawn it out for her, and they had gone over it and over it. She was so scared, but nothing was going to hold her back now. Well, it was a crazy plan, but the night to enact the plan had come. And as crazy as it was, it actually started working. She had made it to the island. A small boat paddled out, and then a small swim to get past the guards, and she was there. But getting in to the fort, that was going to be harder. And it would have been impossible if not for the Union soldier that had helped her. He told her of a special way into the fort that only the guards knew and used. So she went and slipped into the fort, totally unseen. So there she stood, inside the fort, dressed as a Union soldier, heart pounding. She stood there for just a moment to gain her courage, and she made her feet begin to walk forward. Now she needed to find her husband. she also needed a way to get him out and get him home. Melanie was armed with a large pistol and a pickaxe, and probably looked very strange walking down the corridors of the fort with that big pistol on her small side and a pickaxe in her hands. But luckily, she hadn't needed to use either yet. Now, she had been told exactly where the keys to the cells were kept. All she needed to do was follow the directions to the room where they were located, and she was stunned when she got there that they were unguarded. Now, she hoped that the cells were unguarded as well. Could her luck hold out that long? To tell the truth, she was shocked that she had gotten this far with no problems at all. Her heart was pounding now with every step she took. She knew she was getting closer to her love. It had gotten to the point that she totally couldn't hear anything for the pounding of her heart. Was it her fear, or was it her love? She rounded the corner and saw the cells, the rows and rows of cells, and the hundreds and hundreds of desperate men. There were soldiers, political captives, and even falsely accused citizens, over 1,000 souls. Her heart went out for all of them, but she couldn't save them all, not yet. It would jeopardize her only chance to save Samuel, her husband. She ran from cell to cell, whispering, "Sam! Sam!" Finally, there he was. Melanie? He could not believe that it was her. He couldn't believe that she was there. Now, many believe if she and her husband would have just left right then, leaving the fort the same way that she came in, that they both most likely would have survived and escaped with their lives. But this brave young lady's plan was so much bigger than just saving her love. To her, that would have seemed selfish. Her sense of duty made her try the very thing that cost her and her husband their lives. One of the cells had a partial dirt floor, and this is why she brought the pickaxe. For days, she now hid as a Confederate prisoner, ditching the Union uniform, trading the blue for gray. And while the guards were away, they would dig. The plans were to free them all. They hid the dirt under the blankets as well as the hole. However, a few nights into the plan, one of the men swinging the pickaxe got too close to the granite wall, and the noise reverberated down the halls of the old fort so that every guard on that side of the fort heard it. Melanie and Sam knew they only had one chance now: run for the entrance that she came in. So they abandoned the plan and ran from the cell. However, they were quickly caught before they could reach the exit. One guard stood in between the lovers and freedom. Now, Melanie didn't want to take a life, but she would for her dear husband. She pulled out that large pistol that she had brought in with her, and she aimed it steady at the guard, and she had him dead to rights. He had not pulled his gun up. She pulled the trigger, but the gun backfired, literally blowing up in her hand, and the bullet and a piece of the barrel went sideways instead of forward. And instead of taking out the guard, it struck Samuel, who was standing right beside her. And it was a fatal strike, hitting him in the face and in the head. She was devastated. All of her fight was now gone. She fell down holding her husband's body, sobbing and screaming uncontrollably. By this time, more guards had made it to the area, and they all rushed in and took her into custody. She was quickly found out to be a woman and not one of the prisoners. But she was still tried as a spy and convicted and sentenced to be executed. Her only request before death was that she be allowed to die in women's clothes. All that they could find around the fort was a black robe. So the Union soldiers dressed Melanie in the black robe and marched her to the gallows in the middle of the fort, with all of the men of the fort watching the spectacle, including the Confederate prisoners. The Union officers felt that it would be a deterrent for any future escape attempts if they made the prisoners watch. It is believed that Melanie Lanier was hung in October of 1862. The Union Army did not make an official record of the incident, probably out of embarrassment. It is reported, however, that immediately after her death, soldiers started seeing a lady in black all around Fort Warren. In fact, she is still seen there today. Park officials say that you can still hear screams coming from the corridors of the fort. Union soldiers of the day reported all kinds of strange incidents, such as being touched, grabbed, scratched, pushed. 2 Union soldiers were even court-martialed for shooting at a phantom in black, and 1 Union guard was brought up on charges for fleeing his post because, as he says, he was chased by a mad woman in black. Today, numerous ghost hunters have gone to the fort and reported receiving evidence not only of the lady in black, but of many other restless spirits as well. Most speak of Confederate soldiers who died while in prison during the war. Now, these ghost reports have even made the local news in Boston. The ghosts at Fort Warren are very well known. In fact, the New York Times actually wrote an article about the ghosts at Fort Warren, but it was actually in 1862, believe it or not, before Melanie died and became the most famous ghost at Fort Warren. Evidently, there were some very strange and crazy things going on there before our dear Melanie. Listen to the New York Times article from January of 1862. And just to remind you, Melanie passed in October of 1862. There are nocturnal spiritual phenomenon. They mix themselves up with the midnight duties of the sentinels who keep their lonely rounds, and that figures of a supernatural character have recently appeared to some of them in the lonely hour of the night, in the vicinity of some rebel graves, and the image of an old woman has been seen vindictively frisking about the ruins of an old building from which she was ejected some time previous to her death. If they are ghosts of the buried rebels, they may some night feel the effects of a Yankee bullet, as it would be some satisfaction to shoot even the apparition of a rebel. So today, if you go visit Fort Warren, one of the very first things the park ranger will do is he will tell you the story of Melanie, the lady in black. Maybe they do it to prepare you in case you hear that haunted scream down the halls, or in case someone taps you on the shoulder and you turn and look and no one's there. Maybe they tell her story to keep alive Melanie's love so powerful it drove a woman to do things most people would be too afraid to even try. Fort Warren still stands, proudly guarding Boston Harbor. Maybe not in the same way she did in the 1800s, but she always stands ready if the United States needs her. And Fort Warren does not have guards at every post anymore, nor artillery waiting to fire today. But when everyone goes home at night and they turn out the lights, I can guarantee you that Fort Warren is not left empty or unguarded. And that's no ghost story. Fort Warren's closed-circuit cameras, after hours, have picked up movement multiple times in the gift shop. It has recorded the screams coming from the long halls of the fort. And yes, they have captured the image of the lady in black multiple times on their motion sensing cameras. Now, every time she is seen, she is retelling her own story. So let us all never forget the story of the Lady in Black.